And it's my great pleasure to welcome Stuart Kaufman to the University of Ottawa today. He's a professor of political science and international relations at the University of Delaware. And his research is on ethnic conflict, international security, and IR theory. Many of you might know him from his book, Modern Hatreds, The Symbolic Politics of Ethnic War. It was with Cornell University Press, and in that book he asked a very big question about what causes ethnic war, what causes ethnic groups to fight wars against each other, and he rejected the kind of simple answer that these are ancient hatreds, and instead and consider a number of possible explanations, but really focused on the importance of myths and symbols, or the stories that ethnic groups tell themselves about who they are. It's a very good book. He won the Grawemeyer Award for that book, and he's been writing on the subject, of course, since, including a brand new book manuscript, which he tells me he's just revised and sent off to the publisher just, yesterday? So that's going to be the subject of today's talk. So we have the good fortune of being the first audience to hear the new and improved version of the new book manuscript. I should also say that Stuart began his career as a specialist on Soviet and post-Soviet politics, and he also worked as the director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs in the National Security Council staff for a year, I believe. So he might have some things to say about current events in Eastern Europe during the talk or the question period too. I don't want to put you on the spot. I didn't warn you about that. In any event, please join me in welcoming Stuart Kaufman to the University of Ottawa.
Okay. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. All right. Make sure I'm mic'd up properly. Thank you very much, Roland. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity, as Roland says, to share with you the new and improved version of my this presentation. This is essentially the theory chapter of this new book manuscript, which, if all goes well, will come out in about a year with Cornell University Press. The title of the book will be Nationalist Passions. The puzzle that I'm grappling with is related to the topic of the first book about what causes ethnic war, but I broadened it out to ask the question: can you come up with a theory that is simultaneously useful for understanding what politics looks like, at least ethnic politics, when there are no serious conflicts, when you have mass mobilization but not necessarily violent mobilization, and when you have violent mobilization in war? Can you have one theory that kind of tells you why things come out the way they do in all those directions? So I've got a bunch of cases that I look at in trying to explain that. Among them, Sudan swings back and forth from peace to war. South Africa, the not quite as miraculous as usually understood transition. Gandhi is an example of nonviolent nationalist mobilization. Got a bunch of other cases as well. To try to figure out, how can we conceptualize that general question. So my assumption is, since the dependent variable is the nature and degree of mass participation, the answer is in the political and social psychology of mass behavior and mass elite relations, right? You can have all kinds of guesses on why elites do what they do, but they can't do it if the it is mass mobilization unless they've got the people on board. The observation is that recent findings in psychology and neuroscience support and refine the logic of symbolic politics theory. In other words, I'm not backing away from the argument in my previous book that myths and symbols and narratives are critically important in understanding why people do what they do. But now I'm tracing the causality in more detail and talking about how those myths then get reflected in prejudices and other social psychological mechanisms that make it work. So I'm in a way kind of putting together political psychology and constructivism. And then I'll make the argument, to the extent I have time at the end, that you can make this into a general theory of politics. So to kind of illustrate what the point I'm trying to make, we'll start with a particular social psychology experiment that was done about a decade ago, which asks the question, why does there seem to be this repeated pattern in the United States of police officers shooting unarmed black men? And so the psychologist created a video game in which the player was asked to identify as quickly as possible whether the person in the video, or actually it wasn't even a video, it was just a still shot, whether the person in the video going like this, are they holding a weapon, are they holding a gun, or are they holding something innocuous? And as quickly as possible they have to press either shoot or don't shoot. And what happens is, if they have time, what they do when they see an armed black man is they hesitate. If they see an armed black man, they quickly hit shoot. If they see an unarmed black man, they hesitate, and then they hit don't shoot. But if they don't have an adequate amount of time, they immediately hit shoot, and they shoot that unarmed black man, right? And the point is that the more familiar they are with the stereotype of blacks being kind of dangerous, the more likely they are to shoot that unarmed black person. Right? So it's just the associative memory, it's just familiarity with the stereotype that does it, even if they consciously reject that stereotype. All right, so the sort of neuroscientific psychological theory about how this works is called the dual systems theory. And the idea is basically that you should think of the brain as having two different systems. The first one is the intuitive system. And the intuitive system is the more powerful one by far. It's in the older part of your brain, evolutionarily speaking. It considers literally a million times more information than your conscious brain does. It responds very strongly to emotional associations, and also to training, to stereotypes of all kinds. This is your knee-jerk reactions to pretty much everything. The second system is the reflective system. That's the frontal cortex that does our actual thinking. The problem is the informational processing capacity of the reflective system is much weaker. Right? So virtually everything you do based on your intuitive system, and then every once in a while your reflective system kicks in and says, wait a minute, is that the right thing? Right? So that's what goes on in that shooter game. Right? You do your knee-jerk thing, but if you spot a discrepancy, then maybe your reflective system kicks in. So the psychologist Jonathan Haidt suggests that a good way to think about this is as a metaphor where you imagine an elephant and its rider. The elephant is the intuitive system. The rider is the reflective system. As you can imagine, the rider on an elephant doesn't have a heck of a lot of control on the elephant. And often finds itself in the position of saying, sorry about that, what we trampled back there. Right? And the rest of the time, you're the PR firm. Oh, here's why that was a good idea. All right? Doesn't actually make the decision, it rationalizes the decision later. All right, so this is the critical point here. What I'm saying is most of what we do, politically and otherwise, is our intuitive system deciding this is what we're going to do. And then if somebody asks us, we rationalize later and try to think of ideas for why that might have been wise. So that's it. People are not rational decision makers. This is where I get into a lot of trouble. If you assume rational decision making, you're just starting with a false premise, a literally false premise. So if you get the right answer, it's going to be by accident. People are rationalizers of intuitive gut reactions. I asked my class the other day, because when I was presenting this theory to them, I just kind of give them one lecture on it. Not even that, 5 minutes. Raise your hand if you think that people cast their votes based on a careful consideration of the issues. Nobody raised their hands. Raise your hands if you think that people cast their votes on the basis of intuitive gut reactions. Every hand went up except for the ones who were sleeping. Right, so that's what I'm arguing. If you want to understand political behavior, look at where these intuitive gut reactions are coming from. Don't look at logic. This is not a new idea. David Sears has been writing about this stuff for something like 35 years. He defines symbolic predispositions as stable affective responses to particular symbols. So the point is affective. It's just a question of, do you like it, do you not like it? And if you have a stable predisposition to react in a certain way, that's going to be what's going to drive those intuitive gut reactions. So what Sears finds is that party ID, ideology, and racial prejudice are the most important symbolic predispositions for politics. And it works better now for American politics than it did then. I mean, if you ask people ideology, party ID, and get something that'll indicate their affective feeling about African Americans, 90+%, you're going to guess what their vote is. But even in 1980, he said symbolic attitudes had strong effects on issue voting, and self-interest had almost none. Right? It doesn't. People don't vote their pocketbook. All right. Liberals are people who vote in favor of higher taxes for themselves in the United States, and conservatives are people who vote against government programs that benefit themselves. They're voting ideology. They're not voting their interests. Drew Weston, a psychologist, more recently found that if you expand your consideration of symbolic predispositions to a broader range of them, you can explain a lot of kinds of attitudes. So for example, he asked, he had a panel sample, right? So he did 2 different interviews of the same people. In the first interview, he asked them about their symbolic predispositions. How do you feel about political parties? How do you feel about Clinton? How do you feel about marital fidelity? How do you feel about feminism? And then 6 to 9 months later, he asked them, so now that they're talking about impeaching Clinton, do you think he ought to be impeached? The answer is, with an R-square of 0.85, right? So he can explain 85% of the variance. On their answers to that question, should Clinton be impeached, on the basis of what they said 6 to 9 months earlier about their symbolic predispositions. If you like Clinton, if you're a Democrat, you're not going to be in favor of impeachment. Right? If you're a Republican and you don't like Clinton, and those of course are also going to be correlated, you're more likely to want to. Right? Throw in those other things. How do you feel about marital fidelity? Right? If you're a conservative Democrat who cares about that, impeach the bastard. When you add in knowledge of additional facts, if you try to give people additional facts to change their position, that has a 0.03 effect, right? You can bring up the R-square from 0.85 to 0.88 on the basis of information, right? So that's my overall theoretical point, right? 85% of what's going on is people's gut feels, 3% is the facts. I'll go with that. So when it comes to ethnic politics, there's lots of good social psychological reasons to think that ethnic identity, ethnic prejudices are going to be really powerful, much like racial prejudices are. We know about social identity theory, right? You divide people even randomly into 2 groups, and people very quickly start showing favoritism towards members of their group. Then there's prejudice theory, right? Lots of good evidence that prejudice matters. I actually do get obnoxious enough in the introduction of my book to say that the notion that prejudice is important for understanding ethnic politics is so obvious that only a political scientist could not get it. So the argument is that narratives of group identity create prejudices towards outgroups that are defined as an enemy, right? Once you're prejudiced against them, you're more likely to see them as threatening, right? And more likely to be in favor of discriminating against them, both. 2 different pathways push in the same direction towards conflict. All right, this one's really a fascinating study here. Low prejudice is consequential even when institutions change. Now, here's what I mean by institutions change. So, if you look at essentially the current nation of Moldova, in the interwar period, it was divided. The Transnistria part was in the Soviet Union. The Bessarabian part was in Romania. So the folks there were subject to a national experiment. Overwhelmingly Romanian-speaking people, as anti-Semitic as anybody else in Eastern Europe, which means very. But the Soviet Union had a very strong anti-prejudice propaganda line in the 20s and 30s, while Romania did not. So when the Holocaust begins, it turns out that people, and so the Romanian army takes control of the entire area, both halves, and begins killing Jews. It turns out that people on the former Soviet part of the border, that is to say the ones who had been hearing 20 years of anti-racist propaganda, were much more likely to help Jews escape and much less likely to collaborate in oppressing them than were people on the other side of the river who had not been exposed to that set of narratives, right? So in other words, pretty good evidence that when prejudice goes down, behavior changes, even if you're later told, go ahead and and discriminate against those people. Folks on the north side of the river didn't want to do it. So another psychological mechanism that you have to look at, and there's nothing shocking about this except for the strength of effect, is what's called terror management theory. In experiments, if you prime people to think about death, they become consistently more kind of militant, conservative on social and defense issues. So they're more likely to show respect for their own symbols, to support politicians who talk about supporting their own symbols, less tolerant towards diversity or variation in any way, more punitive, more physically aggressive, all of those things. And there's a whole series of studies you can see, two of them bookended with 20 years of work in between, that's shown this to be true. Here's one illustration. So during the 2004 presidential campaign in the United States, they did an experiment at Rutgers University. That's New Jersey, so it's a blue state, it's a liberal state. And they asked in the control condition, who do you favor in the election campaign? Do you like John Kerry or George Bush? 57% liked Kerry, 13% liked Bush, which is about what you expect from young liberal New Jerseyans. In the experimental condition, people were primed to think about death first, and then asked who they liked better, Bush or Kerry. And it flips. 46% in that condition said they favored Bush. 20% favored Kerry. Right? It's experimental design, random selection, random assignment. So the only thing that's different is the experimental intervention. When you've got any kind of sense of threat, you start feeling more kind of defensive in that way.
How were they primed to think about that?
The control people were told, think about TV. What comes to mind when you think about TV? People in the experimental condition were told, think about the fact that you'll die someday. How does that make you feel? That's all it took. All right, so there's another thing that comes out of prejudice theory that matters for all this, which is what I call social threat. I had to make up the name because the psychologists have different kinds of social threats, that all of which have similar types of effects, but nobody kind of put it all together. Right? So there's the realistic group conflict. I mean, sometimes it actually matters that our group is getting access to resources, but their group is getting more, so we should resent that. Right? And again, it's the group interest that matters. You care even if you personally don't have anything at stake in this. But then there's symbolic threat, right? So American racists convince themselves that they're not racist against blacks because blacks are black. They're racist against blacks because blacks are lazy. All right, so they're saying they're defending this notion of hard work, right? But there's also these issues of group status. Anything that kind of suggests that their group has a higher status than ours causes a great deal of resentment, right? And all of those kinds of political threat increase negative feelings towards the outgroup, right? The political psychology piece is that, if you add this up, physical threat primes aggressive nationalism, so that's going to be associated with ethnic violence. Political, or actually I should have changed it, social threat to interests, to group interests, group status, moral values, that's going to increase prejudice, and it should be associated with contentious politics. In other words, think about the politics of the Tea Party in the United States now, right? It's all about things like that. It's about group status, about the moral values that they see. And in general, greater levels of prejudice is going to be associated with more ethnic conflict. And if there's no prejudice, or prejudice is low, threat is low, then you should get a more quiescent sort of politics. All right, so the next piece is turning what's happening at the mass level, or sort of the individual level, into the group level, right? And the way politicians do that is by using frames. Nothing new here. So I like Gamson and Modigliani's definition. A frame provides meaning to an unfolding strip of events. The frame suggests what the controversy is about, the essence of the issue, right? So the point is, when you talk about abortion, right, are you saying the issue is the right of the woman to choose? Is it a freedom issue? Or is it a right to life, right? By deciding which aspect of the situation is the core one, you're indicating what the answer ought to be. And so my argument is frames work by appealing to symbolic predispositions. Whether it's a value, an ideology, a stereotype, whatever it is. That's how it works. You say pro-life, people are going to have a gut reaction to that. If you ever tried having a rational discussion about abortion to somebody who has strong feelings about it, you get the point. Logic doesn't penetrate. Right? People have strong feelings, and that means they're not going to think about it. They're just going to defend their position. I wish I could dispense with this slide because it clutters up my whole theory. It makes it a lot more complicated than I want it to be. But unfortunately, the social movement folks and the framing theory folks are right. Just having a good frame by itself doesn't necessarily work. First of all, the person using the frame has to be credible. The frame has to be credible in itself. It's got to be some kind of logical connection. Yeah, this makes some sense. It's got to be salient. It's got to be something that the audience cares about. It also needs to resonate with those symbolic predispositions. The framing theories call that narrative fidelity. And then social movement theorists point out that a master frame of injustice, saying something's unjust, tends to work well in mobilizing mass social mobilization. And so that gets back to the sort of the values thing, right? And the status thing. We're being unfairly treated by them. Doesn't matter who them is. So all that boils down to, or I boil it down to 6 hypotheses to understand what ethnic politics is going to look like. And, subtext, what any politics is going to look like. Number 1, hostile group narratives tend to increase prejudice. Number 2, prejudice tends to increase the likelihood that you're going to perceive a threat. Prejudice also increases popular support for hostile and discriminatory policies, right? If I don't like those people, then yeah, we should discriminate against them. 4, stronger threat perceptions tend to increase support for hostile and discriminatory policies. That's straight terror management theory. 5, use of assertive frames by leaders increases likelihood of ethnic mobilization, right? So if you got leaders who are using these kinds of assertive frames, that mobilizes the opinion, convinces people to think about issues in ethnic terms, and gets the ball rolling. But then the other piece of it is you need organizational networks. Somebody standing up on a street corner isn't going to be very important unless they get an organization structured, right? So the difference between the Tea Party movement in the United States and the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States, both of them had pretty good frames. One of them got organized, the other didn't. One of them's still there, the other isn't. So if you look at this graphically. So I'm starting with narratives up at the top, just like I always have. But I'm arguing that the pathway by which they work is that the narratives increase prejudice or influence other symbolic predispositions. Those symbolic predispositions connected with others' behavior and also with what the leaders are saying, those all influence threat perceptions. Threat perception, in turn, determines whether there's going to be support for public mobilization, right? If it's a physical threat, then you might want to mobilize violently. If it's a social threat, you're going to want to mobilize non-violently. And then, so you put all that together with the leaders' framing, public support, organization, and the rest, and you get mobilization. So if I want to explain just sort of the middle part of this theory, or test it, the predispositions leading to threat perceptions leading to public support. Here's some data from 1991. A survey was done in South Africa. And I was interested in the question, how do you explain why the whites of South Africa were willing to vote to give up power, which is what they did in the spring of 1992. They voted in a referendum to support President de Klerk's policy of negotiating with the ANC, understanding full well the result was going to be a black-dominated government. So what explains people's willingness? The dependent variable is belief that de Klerk will bring peace, right? In other words, generally, support for what de Klerk's up to. Right? I think this is going to work, is what people are saying. How do you explain their decision to do that? Well, it turns out it's all symbolic predispositions. I don't have quite as good an R-square as Drew Weston because I didn't get to design the survey. But it's still over 50%. I got more than 50% explanatory power with 5 variables, all of them symbolic predispositions. Right, first one, the most powerful, it turns out, is party identification. Trust in party was unbelievably powerful in South Africa. Next are all mostly symbolic predispositions about blacks. Do you believe that South Africans share sufficient goodwill? In other words, do you have a certain amount of trust for blacks? Races should share classrooms, right? So that's a straight up, you know, can you support racial integration? The credibility of the leader, de Klerk is sincere, also turns out to be important. It's at the bottom of the list, though, interestingly. Not as important as the others. And then this sort of hope variable, right? It's the flip side of fear. If people say life in South Africa will be better in the future, they're telling you they're not so fearful. Yeah?
Any questions about Nelson Mandela in this survey?
Not in this one. Okay. In later surveys there were, and the answer, interestingly enough, is that attitudes towards Nelson Mandela do not matter for white opinion. And the reason is because Nelson Mandela did not become the avatar of peace until after he was president, not before. He was, in fact, a much more radical figure before his presidency than most people understand. And both blacks and whites in South Africa saw him that way in the early 90s. Okay, so the final step in putting together a theory is, because remember, I want to understand what politics is like. All right, why does what does politics look like when it's contentious versus violent versus quiet? Ted Lowy, as modified by Zimmerman, as modified by Kaufman, came up with a sort of a typology that's a useful way of thinking about this. So one kind of politics is the politics of distribution, relatively low conflict, pork barrel kind of stuff, right? Everybody gets a little chunk of the pie. Politics of redistribution, if you're taking away resources from somebody and giving them to somebody else, the only way that happens is if you have social movements demanding it. Right. So if the issue is redistribution, you're going to get contentious politics. The politics of protection is the rally around the flag kind of situation. Right. There's an external enemy out there. We're going to all rally to defend ourselves against them. So that's characterized by national solidarity, following the elites against outgroups. And then finally, this is the Kaufman modification, and I would imagine the least controversial. When there's an overwhelming threat out there, you submit to it. So if strong repression leads to submission, and I need that to sort of fill out the logic. And there we have the theory. It only took me half an hour to explain a fundamentally different way of thinking about politics, I am arguing. So The italicized bold variables are the key independent variables, the causes. The just plain old bold at the end is the outcome. So here's the argument. Starting from the top, right? If people perceive an overwhelming political threat, then well, the leadership doesn't have a choice but to be submissive, right? The leadership of that group. Public opinion also has little choice but to be submissive, because if you speak up, the KGB arrests you. So therefore, any organization that group is going to have is either going to be controlled by the state or it's going to be apolitical. And so you're only, the only kind of politics that can result from this is a politics of submission. Now, if there's an obvious physical threat, say 9/11, right, Pearl Harbor, then the kind of leadership that's going to work is going to be a chauvinist, aggressive kind of leadership, right? Somebody who's waving the bloody shirt. Public opinion will then become aggressive towards whoever's considered responsible. The relevant kind of organization is then armed forces or militias, right? If you're an ethnic group feeling threatened and you rally behind a leader saying we got to rebel, you form a militia. And so the result is a pattern of politics, the politics of protection, right? People rally around to fight. A slight alternate path to violence. Right? What happens if the threat is ambiguous, right? George Bush saying, we were attacked by bin Laden, therefore we have to invade Iraq. All right? It's ambiguous by definition because not everybody agrees that that's what the threat looks like. But if prejudice is high, nobody likes Saddam Hussein in the United States anyway. Nobody likes Arabs anyway. Nobody likes Muslims anyway. So an ambiguous kind of threat paired with high prejudice makes George Bush credible on that issue, at least temporarily. So he can push public opinion to become aggressive, join the army, support military action, and you get another politics of protection, which goes back to that previous slide. That's how he got reelected in 2004. Now, if prejudice isn't quite so high, you don't like those people, but you don't hate them that much, and you see a social threat, threat to your group status, to values of some kind, then people are going to be primed to respond to an injustice frame. So public opinion will then follow in this direction of a kind of competitive sort of politics. If they can get the organizational wherewithal to create a social movement, you get contentious politics, a politics of redistribution. And then finally, if prejudice is low, people don't really perceive much threat, then leadership is going to be forced to resort to a benefits frame, to a distributional kind of politics. Public opinion will be materialist, and the relevant kind of organization is going to be political parties. Now, my case for this is Tanzania. And what I found interesting about it was that just because prejudice is low and nobody perceives a threat doesn't mean politicians don't try to stir things up. They do. The interesting fact is that they consistently fail. If threat perceptions are low and prejudice is low, politicians don't have any material to work with. They can light all the matches they want. If there's no tinder, there's no fire. My case is, gee, shock, since I'm standing here, the evidence works out to support the theory. A good example of this sort of overwhelming threat leading to submission is South African blacks in the 1960s. Right? After the Sharpeville massacre, blacks in South Africa got it. Any kind of activism on their part was going to lead to horrible repression. They kept their heads down. An example of sort of an obvious physical threat leading to chauvinist threat frame, joining militias of politics of protection, is the Muslim rebellion in the Philippines in the 1970s. When President Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law in 1972 and sent troops around gathering up guns and so on, Muslims in the southern Philippines saw this as a horrible threat to them, even though Marcos wasn't meaning to target them. He was targeting communists, not Muslims. But it didn't matter. They saw it as a threat, and the result was a rebellion that lasted on and off for the next 40 years. An example of an ambiguous physical threat would be what happened in Sudan in the 1980s. Sudan in the 70s was at peace. But the same President Numeri who had signed the peace treaty in 1972, by the early 80s, is talking about social threats from the non-Muslims in southern Sudan. These people are sort of threatening Sudan's identity as a Muslim Arab nation. Right? And he didn't even so much say it explicitly, he just emphasized his own Muslim and Arab identity. So as a result, he gained support for a redistributive kind of politics, not materially, but symbolically, by imposing Sharia law over the whole country, including the non-Muslim South. And that, of course, is what sparks the South to rebel in the war that leads to the independence of South Sudan 3 decades later. And then, as I said, Tanzania is my case where all of that works out, right? Low prejudice, minimal perceived threat, so you just have routine distributive politics. And I looked and I checked, and it turns out that that's what politicians are talking about. They're talking about I'll build a road, I'll dig a well, because there aren't any plausible threats they can point to. Now, the other thing is, the world doesn't always line up according to the boxes the way I had them laid out, right? Sometimes all the variables don't point in the same direction. And my argument is when that happens, what you get is an unstable kind of politics. So Sudan in the 70s is precisely that kind of unstable politics. The problem is the prejudice is high, right? And lots of people are perceiving social threats from the non-Muslim nature of southern Sudan. But Numeri decides that his political strategy is going to be different. He's not going to play on that. He wants peace. He wants economic development. So he pursues a politics of distribution. And he gets away with it for a while, as long as there's some hope that there might actually be economic growth as a result. By the early 80s, that's not working. Not only does Numeri hype a social threat, he then provokes a rebellion in the South. So now there's a physical threat. And so you get a politics of protection that drives Sudan more and more into a warlike mood, to the point that when Numeri himself is removed in 1985, none of his successors can end the war. Because high prejudice, physical threat, people are not in a mood to compromise. Another example of this is how Gandhi achieved his success. It turns out that Indians don't hate Brits that much, but they weren't exactly happy with them in the early 20th century either. So I rate that as kind of moderate level of prejudice. Threat is social, right? British aren't slaughtering Indians, but they're certainly discriminating. But before Gandhi shows up, the Indian National Congress is sort of an elite political party that's pretty accommodative. They sent petitions to the British government, which the British government duly ignores. So Gandhi shows up and in the 1920s starts saying, well, we can organize a social movement around this. Right? So the stability of the 1910s is unstable. The stability is unstable. Yeah, I actually meant that. Because as soon as somebody manages to get the resources to build a social movement organization, as soon as a credible leader emerges to mobilize people, you're going to get mass mobilization against what the British are doing to India. So that's why you get the tumult of the 1920s and onward. I'll skip that. Just briefly mention, the previous version with this kind of nice, neat set of arrows flowing downward is, of course, a simplification. The fact is, and here, if you're a constructivist, you'll like this because you can reframe most of what I'm saying as a matter of mutually constitutive relationships, right? So the narratives and the symbols, for example, mutually constitute each other. The threat perceptions and the prejudices mutually constitute each other, right? If you're prejudiced, you're more likely to see a threat. If you see a threat, you're going to become more prejudiced, right? It works both ways. So you can conceive it that way. The reason I don't is because I want to emphasize a difference in sort of the time scale. So that in the short term, the prejudices don't change the narratives. That takes a long time. So the symbolic predispositions are fixed in the short term, right? You can't make prejudice go away in the short term. In the long term, maybe, right? If the threats are gone for long enough, they stop hating each other. But it takes a long time. So I think it's more useful to think about it in terms of causal effects and feedback rather than as mutual constitution. But you can do it either way. Almost out of time. So I think what I'll do is just kind of point out that you can apply the same logic to lots of other things. It started out with Sears as a theory of public opinion and voting behavior, right? And so I would argue if you use all of these concepts, you can explain lots of voting behavior pretty much anywhere. Political campaigns, same thing, right? If you want to understand why political campaigns have so much idiocy in them, right? Why is there so much about kissing babies, waving flags, saying empty things, slinging mud? Well, it's all about manipulating symbolic predispositions, appealing to people's ideology, to people's prejudices. You sling mud to create negative symbolic predispositions towards your adversary, right? It doesn't matter if it's true. It only matters if it sticks. Now, let me leave it there. So that's what I claim is just a fundamentally different way of thinking about politics. Today it helps us understand ethnic politics, but tomorrow, well, I'm not too modest. I'll take your questions now.
Thank you. Thank you. That was terrific. I just want to remind everybody, Stuart's going to call his own questions, but please identify yourself and wait for the mic, and no big long speeches, please. I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question if I can. Could you go back a few slides to the one that has the big chart back further? No, back further. Yeah, maybe back. Yeah, right there. Okay, and my guess is that actually there'll be a few questions just about this framework, so maybe just leave it there for now. I guess, I wonder about whether there's an element of determinism here in the sense that you're describing equilibrium outcomes, and when there's unstable politics, the implication seems to be that it will ultimately revert to the equilibrium outcome. And, what's the possibility for fundamental change in, threat perception, for example? So you mentioned South Africa. What are the prospects that somebody like Mandela can basically run a unstable strategy, an accommodationist strategy, basically directly confronting threat perception within his own community and also in the white community, and in so doing change the threat perception? And if that's possible, then how do you accommodate that kind of a scenario? Because it seems important, because as I heard the presentation, I felt a little depressed by the prospect for actually moving out of these vicious circles.
Well, the short answer is yeah, the prospects for peace in these cases is pretty depressing. But that said, I don't mean to imply that there's no way out. And in fact, I look at a case, as you say, South Africa, where there was a way out. So the answer is that prejudice and threat perceptions are really powerful in pushing politics in a particular direction. But the thing is, the threat perception is manipulable in the short run if they just stop killing each other temporarily. right? So not surprisingly, the first step towards peace has to be a ceasefire, right? Once people stop killing each other, right, then the threat perception goes from 100% down some, all right? And that then leaves room for leaders to start maneuvering, all right? Now, the leader is going to be swimming, upstream, swimming against the tide, so it's going to be difficult. But it's possible, if the leader has a strong political party, preferably backed by a social movement behind him, to make the case that an accommodative frame can work. Hey, peace is a win-win. The problem is that the politics of fear tends to trump the politics of hope. And so what happens in South Africa, for example, is that it ends up being a very long chapter because it's a very long story, the short of which is the politics of apartheid has to have been shown to fail. All right? So the old kind of South African Afrikaner politics of, we got to unite against the black threat, and they actually use that phrase, the black threat or black danger. After 40 years of apartheid, people started figuring out that this wasn't working anymore. And so de Klerk was now able to make the case that the status quo was actually more threatening than moving forward into something new. So, basically you need a lot of things to go right to get out of that negative cycle. You need a leader on the white side like de Klerk who's determined to do the right thing. He was backed by a deeply trusted national party, by a series of social movement organizations like the Broderbund, by business interests and a whole lot of other social organizations separate from the national party, but all saying the same thing: we can't go on like this anymore. And he was matched by a Mandela whose radical image among blacks was pivotally important at this stage. Remember, he's the guy who created the armed wing of the ANC. Most people forget about that part. Right? So he had a lot of credibility with the radicals. So here was a guy who was himself a radical saying, okay, I'm all in favor of armed force if that's going to work, but right now we got a chance to talk. Let's do it that way. So he famously says at one point, we don't want a war because we can't win a war, but we can win an election. So let's move forward in that direction. Right? So everything's got to line up the right way for leadership and organization to fight back against prejudice and threat perceptions, to sort of wrench politics onto a new track. And then once that's established, then the threat perceptions can become durably low, and then give it about 50 years and the prejudices will start to decline as well.
Thanks again for coming to give a wonderful talk to us. I have a lot of questions, maybe because, I don't know, maybe you went a little too fast for me. So let me ask this. It seems to me that there are a lot of necessary conditions for peace, none of which are sufficient, according to your theory. And that seems very plausible. How do you operationalize these variables? For example, when you say level of prejudice in India was high or low, what kind of sources of evidence do you use to adjudicate whether it was high or low? Similarly, narratives. How do you measure resonance in a way that's non-tautological? And if you could just maybe give me more flesh around these variables, how you measure them, how you put them together, I would appreciate it. Maybe I'll have more questions later, privately. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent set of questions. And the short answer is the reason my first book didn't go into all this stuff is precisely because it's so hard to separate out those factors. In principle, what you want to do, and I do wherever I can find the data, is you measure the prejudice through survey research data, right? Like the kind of stuff I presented, right? If you're in favor of the integration of racial integration in classrooms, that's a pretty good indication that your level of prejudice is relatively low, right? And so you can show that the level of racial prejudice among South African whites declined over the late 80s and early 90s, as a result of various other things. so that's how you measure prejudice ideally, all right? You measure the resonance of a frame by I define that. I mean, frankly, I don't go into this too much in this book, but in principle, you define the national narrative on the basis of things like founding documents, official histories, things like that. All right. And so then the interesting question becomes, to what degree is the leader appealing to the standard narrative in those documents, and to what degree is he or possibly she appealing to a different narrative or trying to change it in some way, right? So that, that's the way. You're right. You have to define these things as separate factors to show that there might actually be an influence from one to the other. And it's tough. There are cases where I just don't have survey research data from 1920s India, so I don't know. But I can tell you that based on what public speakers are saying in India in the 1920s and the way audiences are reacting to them, that anti-Muslim rhetoric has a lot more resonance than anti-British rhetoric does. So prejudice against Muslims is a lot tougher, than prejudice against Brits. It's so some of it's inductive. At that point, I'm getting a little circular, but you use what you got. Yes. And all right. Well, I guess you're there. So Marie, go ahead.
Thank you, Stuart, for this great presentation. I'm really happy to see that Kaufman 2.0 has stuck with some framing, some social psychology, much more so than your previous book. And that, I think, has allowed you to really get into some of the mechanisms that we didn't really get in the first book, right? That being said, I'm wondering if there's not some elements that we had in the first book that got lost along the way. And I'm talking about context. And I think that you're very much focused on the process of the framing and the symbolic politics, but I think we're missing some key contextual variables to understand how this all happens. For example, all of the narratives, where do they come from? You're talking about these narratives that play on predispositions, right? But I think there's a lot of contextual variables that come and interact and help build on these narratives. There's also leaders involved there too. I mean, you have the leaders come in at, I guess, step 3. The narratives are constantly being built, right? I think where context also really matters, and it sounds like I'm not asking a question, but the question will be, where does context come in all of this? But what's the trigger for violence in all this? Because obviously these perceptions of threat can actually exist prior to all of to the violence, right? You can have it exist or have these frames exist for years before the violence takes place. So there's a trigger there, and isn't there an answer in context there also?
Okay, great questions, Marie, thank you. Okay, so I'll take it as basically 2. One is, where do the narratives come from? And so, okay, when I give you the full, or it's still not full, the fuller version of the diagram, what you can see is, I agree with you that where do the narratives come from? Well, they come in part from the way leaders frame issues. Right? If a particular frame gets repeated often enough, it kind of gets incorporated into the national narrative. The relevant others do also gets fed into that narrative. And obviously, it's not just political leaders, but social leaders and lots of other people change narratives. So absolutely, that's certainly true. I mean, as far as the sort of this shift between war and peace, the argument I'm trying to make is that shifting either way is hard. I don't want to be too pessimistic about this in the sense that while it's difficult to get from peace to war, it's also difficult to get from war to peace. Because if prejudice is low, then a a politician with chauvinistic kind of framing is going to fail. Similarly, if threat perceptions are low, it's hard to gin up a threat, even if prejudice is high. Look, these guys haven't caused any trouble lately. I got other problems, right? If you've got all three of those things, but not an organization to back you, then a chauvinist leader is likely to be a flash in the pan, right? Rise for a while, quickly fall if they don't have an organization to back them. So that's part of the argument. That may be more answering somebody else, but that's a big part of the story. Is that there are a lot of it's a lot of necessary conditions both ways. I put it more. I don't put it in terms of necessary and sufficient. I put it more in terms of probabilistic effects. Right. The more you see of this, the more you're pushing in that direction. My argument is very much that, it's inherently probabilistic, right? You can't say, check boxes A, B, and C, and you get a war. That's never going to be true. But so, when you get to the question about a trigger, my argument is that the trigger doesn't matter if the other elements aren't there. If prejudice is low, threat perception is low, one big incident of violence does not then lead to a war. Right? But if the tinder is there and and there's lots of oxygen and the weather's hot, then one spark and everything goes boom. Right? And then my final point would be to say the cases have plenty of context in them. I'm the last person to say that all you need is my four variables, check the boxes, and that's the answer. But what I try to do, frankly, is to stuff as much context as possible into those boxes. So that, for example, one of the things that dropped out from my previous discussion is opportunity structure. And the reason for that is I figured out that opportunity structure can be reconceptualized so that part of it is organization. If you have an organization and they don't, those kinds of things. And the other part of opportunity structure has to do with threat. So I managed to get all the opportunity structure aspects of the context stuffed in there without actually saying opportunity structure. There was somebody had thank you.
Hi, my name is Eric Van Rijthoven, and I'm from Carleton University. Thank you very much for coming and giving this talk today. It was very interesting. I guess my question is, you call this symbolic politics, but it only seems to be about the symbols that have any kind of affective or emotional resonance. The other symbols, they just don't matter because they don't mobilize anything. And that leads me to the question of, does your book or does your theory have an underlying concept or theory of emotion? And where is that situated in terms of the broader work that's been done on emotion and threat in IR? So people like Netta Crawford or Jonathan Mercer or Andrew Ross.
Excellent question. So the short answer is I had to simplify somewhere, and that discussion was what I ended up having to cut out. I don't specifically reference those literatures in IR or the literature on emotion in general in psychology, just because it would have taken an already incredibly complicated theory and just made one more complicated piece of it. It actually was there in the earlier version of the book, but I realized that I wasn't explaining it well enough, and to do so would have required a third theory chapter. I already have two fat ones too. So it sort of had to fall out. But the argument I would make is that I did think it through, and the earlier version of this chart had a column about kind of what's the dominant emotion that's being appealed to here. So if you think about it, it's sort of obvious. Physical threat, that's all about fear, right? Social threat, well, that's Roger Peterson's resentment. The high level of prejudice, well, that's the hate part. On the social redistribution stuff, well, there's some hope in there, right? Or greed. right? So I make the case in the conclusion that you can start, you can continue with that. There's all kinds of lovely implications for political theory as well, because what this allows you to do, this kind of framework, is to bring moral issues back into empirical, into the core of empirical analysis by saying, look, this person's appealing to fear, that person's appealing to greed. If you want somebody who's got the whole package, look at people who engage in human trafficking, especially of women, and prostitution, right? Because they're appealing to fear, greed, lust, and that's a pretty powerful combination. I think that is indeed a piece of this that ought to be filled out. I did think about it when I was pulling it together. It was just something that, for the sake of some minimal amount of parsimony, I had to leave out. Hey, if you want to pick up on it, you're more than welcome. Michael.
Yes, Stuart. Michael Williams from the Graduate School. Thanks, like everybody. Thank you very much for coming and for a great talk. I think I probably want to pick up on what Srdjan maybe was trying to get at. He's smarter than I am, but I'll try anyway. Which is this concept of prejudice. Is the idea that prejudice is non-narrative, that it is not narrativized? And if so, then how do we get a handle on the topography of prejudice? Is prejudice just a reservoir that is there to be mobilized? Or does prejudice actually have a topography that makes certain narrative mobilizations more likely, more powerful? And if so, how do we get at that kind of dimension of prejudice?
That is a great question. Okay, so what I do is, now I'm going to blank on the author. I've got a definition of prejudice that has several components to it. And basically, there's a narrative component and the non-narrative component, right? So the key two components for me are a negative affective reaction to the target. But then there's also the stereotypes, which is the narrative part. It turns out that both of them have independent effects. So somebody without a negative feeling affectively towards blacks, but familiar with the stereotype of the dangerous black, will still discriminate against them in the shooter game. But the people who really don't like blacks are going to discriminate a lot more. All right. So what I think is very interesting and useful about that kind of concept is that it helps you understand why some prejudices are so mutable, so malleable. Why is it that Jews can be simultaneously communists when you're in Nazi Germany and anti-communists when you're in the Soviet Union, right? And the answer is, well, as long as you got the negative affective polarization, people don't like them anyway, they're more inclined to believe any negative thing about them. So there's two different things. The stronger entrenched any particular narrative is, the more, again, it goes back to associative memory, right? The deeper it is in associative memory, the easier it's going to be to prime that, to get people thinking in those terms. And that's going to be independent of the amount of affective feeling, right? But then the stronger the amount of affective feeling, then, again, the better it's going to work. And so part of the problem is while it's possible to knock down a particular stereotype, it's often harder to knock down the negative affective charge that goes with it, right? And then the third piece of the definition of prejudice is then a predisposition to do something about it, right? Which is what makes it a symbolic predisposition, right? Not only do you have these feelings, not only are you familiar with these narratives in the form of stereotypes, but then you're also predisposed to act on it one way or another.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Mark Farrer, and I'm a consultant demographer. My interest in your presentation is the kind of the war-peace continuum, and how do you maybe get more towards the peace and further away from war? But I'm kind of dismayed by you seem to say it's more easy to get from peace to war than vice versa. And we're in a framework where emotion seems to be more powerful than reason. And so how do we get to this more to the peace, and how do states or societies build up their antibodies towards being the triggering these chain of events into war? And finally, how would you analyze the situation of where we, in real time today, we have a small group called ISIS, the Islamic State. They seem to be using your model, saying just how can one tiny little group, involved in the symbolic politics, disgraceful and outrageous that they are, but to be able to provoke world powers into radically changing in a matter of days the whole foreign policy and sending airplanes and bombs, and it's inevitable, trying to eliminate people who they don't even know what they look like. In fact, in Libya, many of these people were their allies. So, I mean, how do we get back to the rule of reason and peel back the emotion? Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. A bunch of excellent questions there. Okay, so let me say first, repeat something I said before. I'm not arguing that it's easier to get from peace to war than it is from war to peace. I'm arguing that it's hard to move in either direction. Because it takes, a lot of things have to line up in the same direction to get a shift in either direction, right? You got to get, to get from peace to war, you got to mobilize people, you got to get them angry, you got to get them fearful, all those things. So it's not necessarily harder to get from peace to war than war to peace or vice versa. That's one thing. Second thing is, I'm not kind of trying to move us into a world where emotion is important. I'm trying to point out that that's the world we live in and always have. But there's some good news there. I didn't have time to go into this one either, but it turns out, for example, that you can undermine the terror management effect simply by pointing out that it's happening. And that works for basically any kind of subliminal kind of appeal. If you're appealing in a covert way to racism, the way for an opponent to counteract that is to say, you're appealing to racism. Right? If you have a population like, as in most of the West, where explicitly people don't believe in racism, right? They believe in racial equality, but they also have these prejudices that are kind of operating subconsciously under the surface, and often people don't realize themselves that they're acting in a prejudiced way. One answer to that question is, you can count, you can't take emotions out, but you counter one emotion with another. So if you want to build on racial prejudice by saying, we're going to get those people who are, put them in their place, whatever it is, all the opposition has to do is say, that's a racist appeal. We don't believe in that, and anybody who says that ought to be ashamed of themselves. Right? But I know that the majority of our population isn't that kind of person. I know that we are a people who believe in faith and hope and trust, right? That's the kind of rhetoric that you have to use. And my favorite example of what should have been said was by this political psychologist, Drew Weston, who said that he pointed out that in 1980, Ronald Reagan went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is the place where 16 years earlier, 3 civil rights workers had been murdered for the crime of trying to register black people to vote. And Ronald Reagan gave a speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, saying, I believe in states' rights, which is, of course, the code word for the autonomy to be racist if you want to. And so what Weston says is, the right answer that President Carter should have made would have been to say, I know that Ronald Reagan rode into Philadelphia, Mississippi, wearing a white hat. He wasn't really wearing a white hat. He was wearing a white hood. Right? Do we want it? Do we want the kind of person who appeals to the Klan? Is that what we want for a president? Right. If you call them on it, it shifts the the emotional polarity of what they're doing. So the main reason why the left loses to the right is that they don't get that. They understand the power and the potency of racial appeals, of nationalist appeals, but they don't know how to answer it, so they run away from it, and thereby cede the issue. Right, so it's, back to Michael's question about narratives. Right, the point is to reassert a non-violent, non-assertive kind of national identity. And this works. It turns out, for example, that if you do this kind of stuff among Dutch people, if you can make prominent in people's mind, the Dutch self-image is, we're kind of non-violent people, you can get them to show a lot less resentment towards Germans than if you prime them to be thinking about something else. The other sort of issue that's running around under the surface of all this is, part of what I'm saying is that all political science theories are based on assumptions about human nature that we bury. And so structural realism says that it has no assumptions about human nature, but it's basically, takes a kind of Hobbesian view of human nature as a kind of a fearful animal. And look, and by the way, there's plenty of good evidence that people who, for example, show greater stress reactions to threat or startlement tend towards the right on these issues. They tend to be more hardline. They tend to be more nationalistic, aggressive, all that stuff. And the argument I'm making is that everybody who makes an argument about this is the true human nature, they're all right, partly, right? Is the human being a fearful animal? Yes. Is the human being a creature of habit? Yes. Is the human animal a creature of capable of affection? Yes. Is the human animal greedy? Yes. Lustful? Yes. All of them. Right? And the question is, to think about politics. What the frames do is they decide which emotion am I going to put front and center of my politics. So yeah, you can appeal to greed, or you can appeal to fear, or you can appeal to hope, or you can appeal to love. Turns out love is really, really hard to translate to politics, which is why you don't see a lot of it. But that's why they kiss babies.
One more question.
I was wondering if you can expand on how individual emotions, like individual perceptions, get translated into groupal behavior. And you say that has to do with the management of frameworks and how leaders appeal to the main emotions that are distributed among the population. But that gives me the impression that leads to a conception of social movements as always consensual, right? Social movements they cannot be authoritarian, they cannot be contradictory, because as they form, people agree to what the leaders are framing, right? So while you apply this politics of distribution, protection, redistribution to intergroup relations, it seems that they do not apply to intragroup relations, right? And that for intragroup relations is just consensual always. So I was wondering if you can expand a little bit on how these frameworks work to translate passions into...
Yeah, that's another 5-page section that I left out, but I wish I had room for it. Okay, so the story is this. If I want to say that prejudice is high among a certain population, that doesn't mean that everybody in that population is highly prejudiced at a certain level. Obviously, there's a distribution. And so if I'm saying that population A is more prejudiced than population B, I'm saying that the average level of prejudice measured on a scale of 1 to 10 is higher, right? There are more people at 10, less people at 1, and so on. I agree with you that there tends to be this assumption that it's all consensual, right? That you've got somebody waving a flag, whether it's coercive or not, and quote unquote everybody's following, right? It's never true that everybody's following. So it's really a matter of how many followers can they muster, right? It only takes a couple thousand people to have a riot, and those couple thousand people can kill a couple thousand people. And that doesn't mean that the rest of the city population is equally prejudiced. What it means is that the conditions emerge for that riot, right? There are enough people who are prejudiced, who are feeling probably some kind of social threat, who were given a certain amount of leadership and organization. It turns out, you study riots, there's leadership and organization there, pretty much always. So it's absolutely the case that it's always going to be a subset of people who mobilize, not the whole group. And that subset can be pretty scarily small. In the South Africa chapter, for example, I've got some data on the preferred strategy among blacks for how to confront the apartheid regime as of 1992, at a time when the ANC was really rethinking its options. And it turns out that the majority of blacks had a position that was more moderate than Nelson Mandela's. The majority of blacks wanted either just to have things calm down or to have negotiations without any kind of protests at all. Mandela's position was a combination of street protests plus negotiations would be the way to move forward. And then there was a 20% minority who were in favor of protests, violent or not, whatever works, forget about talks, just make the government collapse. They referred to that as the Leipzig option. Those 20% were enough to create a horrible amount of violence in South Africa in the 1980s and 1990s. The reason that an agreement was nevertheless reached was because Mandela essentially managed to get the support of the more moderate 80% of blacks and drive forward this process of negotiations leading to a freer election. So I agree with you completely that you don't want to essentialize any group and say they're all like this, right? It's all about variations. There's distribution of attitudes within groups and variations within that. That's where all the action really is.
Unfortunately, we run out of time, but Stuart, you've given us a ton to think about. It sounds to me like there's enough on the cutting room floor for the next book or two books. But it's a really fascinating topic. You have an ability to communicate these complicated ideas very clearly. And I think that it's left us all wanting to learn more about this structure as you've outlined it. So I think you'll have a few readers in Ottawa. In any event, thank you very much for coming and for giving your talk today.
Thank you, Roland. Thank you all for being here.
Oh, and I forgot to mention, this is terrible of me, this was co-sponsored by the Norman Paterson School at Carleton University and the University of Ottawa. So those from Carleton, you're welcome. Let's do this more often.
Thank you all for coming.